All right, so this is the first part of our chapter on bones. And in this chapter, we're mostly going to talk about the anatomy of an individual bone and kind of the tissues found inside of it, as well as physiology associated with bones. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is talk about functions of bones. And so probably most of you, when you think of bones, you would think of their function in support and protection, right, as part of the skeleton. So support and protection. Those are definitely important functions, but also not the only functions of bones, okay? So they allow us to, stand upright, support the muscles, protect things like, our heart and our lungs with the rib cage, our spinal cord with the vertebrae. So support and protection, very important. They also allow us to be able to move, okay? So movement is another big function. Because without bones, muscles contracting wouldn't really do much, right? So a muscle contracting moves a joint. So without the bones, you wouldn't have that joint. So the muscles could contract, but there wouldn't be really much movement of a limb produced. Okay, so those are probably ones that you could think of. Bones are also really important source of mineral storage. All right, especially calcium, right, and phosphate. So minerals are stored in the bones. And we'll talk about the hormones that kind of regulate blood calcium. So that calcium that's stored in the bones. And then we also have in the bones red bone marrow. And so red bone marrow is used to produce all types of blood cells. All right, so blood cell production. And so that's red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are all produced from red bone marrow, okay? And so we'll talk about where that's found in a minute. And then bones also have yellow bone marrow. And so yellow bone marrow is primarily made of fat. And so fat storage is another function of bones. Okay. All right, so those are the functions of bones. So let's take a look at kind of a typical bone and talk about some of the anatomy of that specific bone. Okay, so here we have the humerus, all right? And so we're going to talk about, it's one of the long bones. And so we'll talk about some of the anatomy associated with a long bone, all right? And so first, we kind of divide our long bones into major regions, all right? So we have the epiphysis, that is going to be the head of the long bone, right? So the epiphysis is going to be on the ends, all right? Epiphysis is singular, so we would have one there and then another one here, okay? So two epiphyses, so that's an epiphysis. And then the shaft of the long bone is called the diaphysis, all right? So from here all the way down, right, to the other epiphysis, that's the diaphysis, okay? So this is the shaft, all right, that middle part of the long bone. Okay, and so in between them, you have a structure called the epiphyseal plate. Okay, and we'll talk about this when we talk about how bones are formed. All right, and the epiphyseal plate is present in children and young adults as cartilage, right? So this is made of hyaline cartilage. And it's not shown as that in this picture because as you grow older and you become an adult, that cartilage becomes bone. And then the epiphyseal plate is called the epiphyseal line, all right? So it changes after you finish growing, right? So it's cartilage when you're growing. Epiphyseal line, right? After you're done growing, and so that cartilage just becomes bone. Okay, so really on this picture, what they're showing us here is an epiphyseal line because it's made of bony tissue. And so the epiphyseal plate would be when it's made of cartilage. Okay, so and then you would have another one of those epiphyseal plates or epiphyseal lines here between the diaphysis on the distal end of this bone and the epiphysis. Okay, so you have two epiphyseal plates or lines for each of these long bones. All right, okay, and so then in the central part of our diaphysis, we have this kind of open cavity that's called the medullary cavity. All right, so that's going to be here. So that's the medullary cavity. And the medullary cavity contains yellow bone marrow. All right, and so you can see that, this kind of yellow in there, right? That's going to be our yellow marrow, mostly made of fat, as we said before. All right, and this medullary cavity is also lined with endosteum, okay? So it's lined with connective tissue, all right? So this is going to be covering the inside. Okay, and we're going to talk about that endosteum and the periosteum, which is on the outside, is going to have cells that help to grow the bone. So you can kind of take away bone from the inside of the cavity here, or you can add bone if you need to. And so those cells are going to be found in this endosteum layer. Okay, so that's the medullary cavity with the yellow bone marrow. And so then we said the periosteum is on the outside. So this is a connective tissue. It's dense, irregular. All right, so connective tissue outside the bone. And so we're going to talk about it has numerous different layers. We know that the dense, irregular tissue is important because tendons and ligaments weave into it. All right, so that would be here, this kind of like hazy covering on the outside of the bone. And then there's also a layer of cells that can add and remove bone from that compact bone tissue. All right, and so then our last structure for kind of the anatomy of a single bone would be the articular cartilage. Okay, so this is typically going to be hyaline cartilage. All right, and it's going to be on the ends of long bones. So articular is telling you, articular refers to an articulation, which is a joint. Okay, and so this is going to be cartilage that covers a joint surface. So here, that would be articular cartilage. Okay. All right. We can say hyaline cartilage where a joint is formed. And so typically that is going to be on the ends of long bones. All right. Is where you'll find that articular cartilage. Okay. Good. So that's the anatomy of kind of our single bone. The next chapters we'll be talking about bones, like all the different types of bones and their names and the parts of them. Here we're just talking about if we look at one bone, what are the parts and the important features on each bone. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about that periosteum in a little more detail. All right. So the periosteum is that kind of connective tissue on the outside of the bone, and it has two layers. So it has the osteogenic layer. So this osteogenic layer is going to contain bone cells. And so those bone cells can do two things, right? So they can build bone, or they can break down bone. So there's two different types of cells doing each of those functions. Or break down bone. We'll talk about what those cells are a little later in this chapter. Okay, but those cells are going to be located in the osteogenic layer of the periosteum. All right. And then we have on the outside of that, so this would be directly against the bone. So this would be closest to the bone. Right, because those cells would need to be right on top of the bone in order to break it down or add more bone to it. So then outside of that, you would have this fibrous layer. All right, and so the fibrous layer is what's made of that dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay. So it has lots of collagen fibers, all going in different directions. All right. And so a unique feature of this fibrous layer is that it has what's called Sharpie fibers, or you may see them referred to in your book as perforating fibers. All right. So these are collagen fibers from that fibrous layer that actually go into and penetrate the bone tissue. Okay. So this is collagen that penetrates the bone tissue. And so it helps to anchor that fibrous layer to the surface of the bone. All right, penetrates the bone. Okay, and so you can see it here. All right, it's all these little fibers actually weaving into the bone tissue itself. Okay. All right, good. And so with the fibrous layer of the periosteum, we're also going to find a lot of blood vessels and nerves running through here. One of the reasons with the nerves in particular, when you break a bone that is so painful, is because you have nerves all in this connective tissue surrounding your bone. And so when you have a piece of bone that's broken or moving, rubbing against it, that's very, very painful. So most of that pain sensation is coming from that periosteum. All right. Okay. And so then kind of relating to this, we mentioned that one of the important functions of the periosteum is that it is where tendons and ligaments attach to bones. Okay. So a tendon, again, is going to connect muscle to bone. All right. And a ligament is going to connect bone to bone. So that's the difference between a tendon and a ligament. All right. And so both of them would weave, right? Remember, they're made of dense, regular connective tissue, and they're going to weave those collagen fibers into this periosteum, all right, and really anchor into it. And because that periosteum is anchored tightly into the bone because of those Sharpie fibers, that really helps to stabilize that connection between the tendons or the ligaments and the bone. All right, good. So that's the outside of the bone. So now let's move towards the inside of the bone, all right, and talk about the bone matrix. Okay, so we know bone is a connective tissue, all right, and that means that it is going to have a matrix. The matrix is made up of ground substance and fibers. So we've talked about with bone in our tissue chapter that the ground substance of bone is called osteoid. All right, it's secreted by the cells that make bone as osteoid, and then that osteoid is gonna calcify into this really hard calcium phosphate matrix. Okay, so this would be, calcium phosphate. All right, and remember, that's what makes bone really hard and tough. Right? And then the fibers in bone are going to be collagen. All right, and collagen also is very strong, but the presence of collagen in bones gives the bones a little bit of flexibility. All right. Okay. So the osteoid, that calcium phosphate matrix, gives bones hardness, and the collagen gives it a little bit of flexibility. All right. Okay. And so if you didn't have one or the other, so if we didn't have calcium phosphate in our bones, all right, they would just be really flexible. They actually would almost just be kind of like rubber, because all you would have is this collagen. So you just have kind of these rubber band type bones, all right, which are not going to be very helpful, for holding us upright and providing support. If we didn't have collagen in our bones, that would make the bones very brittle, right? So we would just have the calcium phosphate, which is hard, but it's not flexible at all. So if there was any kind of strain or tension put on that bone, it could very easily break, all right? So it's very brittle. Okay, so that's the matrix, all right? Also, important feature of connective tissues, we have our matrix and then we have scattered cells. So let's talk about those scattered cells and the different types, all right? So our bone cells. So our first bone cell is called an osteoprogenitor cell, okay? And so an osteoprogenitor cell, or I'm going to put it in parentheses, an osteogenic. Just so if you see that word, it means the same thing, an osteogenic cell. And so these are the bone cells that can undergo mitosis and make other new bone cells, okay? And they are found in the periosteum and the endosteum of the bone. So both of those connective tissues, all right? They can undergo mitosis and they can become other bone cells, right? So mitosis, they can make our osteoblasts, all right, which then become our osteocytes. Okay, and so we'll talk about those two in just a second. All right, so these are kind of our cells that make other bone cells, okay? So these cells can undergo mitosis. Our osteoblasts and osteocytes cannot, all right? Just the osteoprogenitor cells. And that's their job, is to make more bone cells. All right, so they're found again in the periosteum and the endosteum of bones. Okay, and so then those osteoprogenitor cells, they would divide. That new cell would mature and become an osteoblast. Okay, so an osteoblast is going to be a bone cell that makes bone matrix. All right, so it makes bone matrix, right? It makes that osteoid. So it makes new bone tissue. Okay. All right, so these are going to be kind of the bone building cells of our bones, all right? And once they lay down that matrix is going to calcify and surround that osteoblast, and it'll mature and become an osteocyte, okay? So an osteocyte is a mature bone cell in a lacuna, all right? So remember, we saw those when we looked at our bone tissue in our tissue chapter. So this is a mature bone cell. All right, and that is what you find in the lacuna we talked about. All right, so that's our osteocyte. Okay, and then our last type of bone cell is called an osteoclast. All right, and so this actually comes from a completely different type of cell. It actually comes from a white blood cell, right, that moves out of the bloodstream and into the bone and becomes an osteoclast. All right, so it comes from a white blood cell because it is a phagocyte, right, like the white blood cell. All right, so there are certain white blood cells called monocytes that can leave the blood, and when they do, they become macrophages or phagocytes in other tissues, okay? So this would be an example of one of those, an osteoclast. All right, and so their job is to break down bone. All right, so these are going to break down bone. Okay, and so usually you would break down bone, one, if you need to remodel it for some reason. If there was a break and it's healing, you kind of remodel that callus that forms. We'll talk about that a little later. They would do that, but also if you need calcium from the bones, these osteoclasts would break it down to release the calcium. Okay, and so what they actually do, I always kind of envision them as looking like little Pac-Man ghosts, right? Like this, okay? And they release little like digestive enzymes, right, out of the bottom. So they just sit right on top of the bone, release a bunch of digestive enzymes Those enzymes are going to break down the bone, and then they can kind of just suck up all that calcium and stuff that they're extracting to put into the blood. All right, so that's kind of how they work. Okay, so those are our bone cells. So now let's just review our bone tissue. So we talked about this in our tissue chapter, so this should be a little bit of a review. All right, here we go. So we're going to start with our compact bone. So in compact bone, it contains osteons, okay? And so that's unique, right? So compact bone contains osteons and spongy bone does not, okay? So an osteon is this complete structure here, all right? So you have these circles of bone matrix with cells, and then in the middle you have this Haversian canal with blood vessels and some nerves. All right, so the osteon, we'll just kind of mark it here so we can label it. All right, would be that guy. Okay, so that's our osteon. In the very middle of the osteon, you always have a Haversian canal. All right, and then surrounding that osteon, you're going to have these kind of circular layers, right? If we zoom in a little, you can see these cells are all kind of this yellow and they look a little like spiky, right? All of these are our little osteocytes in their lacuna. Okay, so we have our, we'll just point at one of them, right? That guy's kind of big, right? Our osteocyte and a lacuna. And so they're in a lacuna, right? A little cave or a cavity, because that bone tissue, that matrix, is so hard, right? It's not like they can swim around freely, so they're stuck in that lacuna. Okay, and so those lacuna are arranged in a circle. Each of those circles is called a lamellae, right? So you can see that, the kind of rings, like this would be one lamella here, right? This would be another lamella here, okay? So those are the rings of the osteon, the lamellae. And then if we look closely, right, those bone cells are kind of connected to each other, right, by these little channels that kind of reach out from one cell, one lamellae to the next. Those are called canaliculi. Okay, so the function of the canaliculi is to connect those lacuna, those osteocytes to each other. All right, and then that way it also connects them to this Haversian canal. So the ones that are closest to the Haversian canal have little canaliculi going to that, and then they're connected to the next ring, and so we can pass along nutrients and that kind of thing through those canaliculi. Okay, good. All right, so that's our compact bone. One other thing with compact bone to point out, I don't have it written on here, so I'll add it, is that we have our Haversian canals. And so if you look, right, so this would be a Haversian canal, right? This would be another one. This would be one, right? And so they run parallel with like the length of the bone, okay? So they run along the length of the bone. Okay, and so there's another series of canals that run perpendicular to that. Okay, and so they are called Volkmann or perforating canals. Okay, so Volkmann canal. And so they run kind of crosswise on a bone. Okay, so we have an example of one here. Right, so that would be a Volkmann canal. So they run perpendicular to the Haversian canals, and that's going to help to bring nutrients, right? So blood vessels from this periosteum actually into the bone, so they can be in that Haversian canal, right? So they connect, and then they also would connect to this medullary cavity in the middle. Okay, so that's our Volkmann canal. I'll just highlight it really quick. There we go. Okay, good. And so that's that's compact bone. So let's talk about spongy bone just briefly for a minute, since we didn't spend very much time at all in our tissue chapter on it. All right, so if we look at spongy bone, We have it here, right? So it's usually right next to or sandwiched in between some compact bone. So we have compact bone here, and then all of this that looks like a sponge, right? That's all spongy bone. Okay, so spongy bone is made up of these kind of extending little arms and branches that weave together that are called trabeculae, right? So trabeculae, like each of these little arms, all right, would be a trabeculae, right? That would be another, all of those. And then there's just a bunch of spaces all in between them where the red bone marrow would be located, okay? All right. And so these guys get all the cells in here, all right, would get their nourishment directly from that red bone marrow, okay? So they don't need these Haversian canals. That's why we see Haversian canals out here. You don't see any Haversian canals in spongy bone because we have red bone marrow surrounding all these guys. So there are little tiny, you can't see them in this picture, but there are little tiny canaliculi. All right, so those canaliculi can just soak up the nutrients from that bone marrow and give it straight to the osteocyte. So they don't need Haversian canals like compact bone does. Okay, good. So we're going to leave that off there for this video. And in the next video, we'll pick up on physiology. So we'll talk about ossification, which is how bone is made. And then we'll spend a lot of time talking about the different ways bone is made and how different types of bone are made and that kind of thing in our next video.